Hello Flight Simmers, and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. This will be lesson 3 of our VFR or private pilot level flight training. In today's lesson we're going to get comfortable with how the aircraft handles at the lower end of the airspeed indicator, practicing flight at approach speeds and slow flight. Before we start talking about the maneuvers, there's one additional control we want to assign. This should have been done in the control setup in the simulator setup video, the first channel overview video, but honestly I didn't find out that you can actually do this until just a few days ago. The control we want to assign is toggle anti-ice, and what this does for us on the 152 is it allows you to turn your carb heat on and off. That's assuming you want to use carb heat if you're not pretending you have a fuel injected engine on this airplane. And if you want to do that, go ahead and assign a key or joystick control. Either one works as long as you have easy access to it, to the toggle anti-ice function. And that'll reduce your workload quite a bit while we do these maneuvers. So you're probably asking yourself, what's the purpose of going out here around these farm fields and flying at speeds that are slow enough that we're letting the tractors pass us? Well, the reason we practice slow flight and flight at approach speeds is because the aircraft handles differently at low speeds than it does at cruise speeds. Well, how does it handle differently exactly? Because the control surfaces use airflow over the controls, they actually use deflection of air to control the aircraft, they're less effective at lower speeds. This is particularly true for the ailerons, which lose effectiveness more quickly than does the rudder or the elevator. Greater control inputs are required to generate the same responses you'd get at a higher airspeed, and the feel is quite a bit different. Pilots describe the feel of the controls at lower airspeeds as sluggish, soft, or mushy. Also, part of the conversation is that the rate of turn for a given angle of bank increases as airspeed decreases. So the aircraft behaves differently that way. What this means is if we were to do a 20-degree bank at 100 knots or 95 knots at our cruise speed, we know we're going to do a full circle in about 2 minutes. That's a standard rate of turn. If we do that same 20 degrees of bank, if we're flying at 55 knots, our approach airspeed, actually our short field approach airspeed, it's going to take us quite a bit less time to make that full circle because our nose is going to come around the compass quite a bit quicker. Converse to that, the radius of turn for a given angle of bank is going to decrease as the airspeed decreases. What that means is if we do a 20-degree bank turn at 95 knots, the circle we draw in the sky is going to be quite a bit larger than the circle we're going to draw if we do a 20-degree banked turn at 55 knots. That circle that we draw in the sky, given no wind, is going to be quite a bit smaller. Another consideration for flying at slower speeds is that the margin from stall speed is a lot less, and we'll get into more depth in stalls in the next lesson. And banking actually increases the stall speed. As you increase your bank, you increase the load factor, and that actually brings the stall speed up. For that reason, bank angles at slower airspeeds should be limited to about 20 degrees of bank, so you don't accidentally stall. Just like steep turns, there's a few things that we want to do before we actually start the maneuver. Just like steep turns, the maneuver should be entered from straight and level flight. And again, like steep turns, we want all the maneuvering, including our descents, to be accomplished above 1,500 feet AGL. And just like steep turns, we're going to start this maneuver at 3,500 MSL. In real life, prior to doing this maneuver or any of your air work, you want to do clearing turns to make sure that the airspace around you is clear. That's usually a 90-degree turn in one direction and then a 90-degree turn in the opposite direction to make sure that there's no traffic around you. Obviously, in Flight Simulator, if you don't have any traffic turned on, you don't need to worry about that. So that's completely up to you if you do that. You might be asking, why didn't we do that for steep turns? And that's because steep turns are considered a self-clearing maneuver. As you do the turn, you're looking out for traffic. The first maneuver that we'll perform will be flight at a typical approach speed for the 152. For this maneuver, our target speed will be 55 knots of indicated airspeed. I would have liked to done the maneuver at 60 knots because that's actually your final approach speed in the 152. But unfortunately, I've discovered that the 152 in flight simulator is not capable of flying 55 knots, at least not consistently, in level flight with the flaps down. So we'll target 55 knots, which is just fine because that is actually our short field approach speed. So that'll get us some practice for that. For the maneuver entry, we want to apply carburetor heat, reduce the power to 2,000 RPM, which will get us slowing down. We'll use pitch to hold altitude and allow the aircraft to slow down. You'll want to trim back as the aircraft slows down, as the nose is going to tend to drop a little bit as you slow down. At 85 knots, you want to extend the flaps to 30 in 10-degree increments, so 1 notch at a time. I only recommend pausing about a second or so in between each increment, though, because the aircraft will slow pretty quickly once you start getting those flaps out. Just like a level off, we want to lead our airspeed target by about 5 knots. Of course, we lead the level off by an altitude. But about 5 knots prior to the target airspeed will increase the power to 2,300 to 2,400 RPM. We'll be back in the green band, so at that point you can take the carb heat off, which you're going to need because you need that extra power, and 2,300 to 2,400 RPM is going to be pretty close to, if not at full throttle, when we're at this airspeed. Once you're stabilized at 55 knots, use your power and pitch to control the altitude and speed. Once you get established at 55 knots, we'll do some maneuvering so you can get a feel for how the airplane flies and reacts and feels at this airspeed. We'll practice turns of up to 20 degrees of bank, and as you're doing the turn, I want you to note the rate of turn and note how it's a little bit faster than what we do when we're doing the same angle of bank at a higher airspeed. We'll practice some descents. This will be a good practice for flying approaches. You want to control the airspeed and the descent just like you did with a normal descent, to control your airspeed with pitch and control your descent rate with power. You can try various descents from fast to slow. I do recommend pulling it to idle and just seeing how fast the airplane will go down when you have full flaps and you're flying at this speed. But I also want you to practice a target of 300 feet per minute, and this is to practice flying a 3-degree glide slope, which is what most of your runway visual glide slopes are set at when you're coming in for a landing approach. Anytime you fly a 3-degree glide slope, a good rule of thumb is that you want to fly about half of what your airspeed is and then add a 0. So if we're flying 60 knots, half of 60 is 30. Add a 0, you get 300. You want 300 feet per minute to stay on that glide slope. We'll also attempt to climb, and you'll notice I did say attempt, and the reason is that even with full power carb heat in at 55 knots, you might get a 100 foot per minute climb in this airplane, but it's not going to do much of a climb at all. And what this demonstrates, the important thing to take away from this is when we get into go-arounds, the airplane does not climb well with full flaps. So the first steps in go-arounds are going to be apply full power, put your carb heat in, and then bring your flaps up to 20 because this airplane does not want to fly or not want to climb at flaps 30. To exit the maneuver and return to normal straight and level flight, you'll want to smoothly apply full power, turn off your carb heat, reduce the flaps to 20. Again, this is the same sort of procedure we'll use for a go-around when we get to that maneuver. At 60 knots, go ahead and retract the flaps in increments up to 0 in the 10-degree increments, just like we do for our normal takeoff. Of course, except in the normal takeoff, we're at 10 degrees instead of 20, so we got 2 notches to go now. Hold the altitude with the pitch. You're going to need to trim the nose down as the aircraft accelerates. It's going to want to nose up. And then at 95 knots, we'll do our normal level off procedure and reduce power to 2,300 RPM and then trim it back for a nice stabilized straight and level flight. Okay, so we are established in straight and level flight at 3,500 feet on a heading of 180. I'm not going to do clearing turns. It'd be kind of boring to watch me do those, and all the traffic is turned off anyway, so I know there's no airplanes out here, but you can do those if you'd like to. So 35 keeps us well above our required entry altitude of 1500. And so we're good there. All of our pre-maneuver chores are complete. Let's go ahead and enter flight at approach speeds. So I will throw my carb heat on, and notice the RPM drop as I do that. Then I will pull the power back to 2000 RPMs. The nose is going to want to drop. So I will pitch up just a little bit and trim up as the airplane nose wants to drop. 85 knots, we'll start getting our flaps out. And you'll notice as we add more and more flaps, the airplane's going to decelerate more and more quickly. It also wants to pitch up just a little bit when we bring that first notch of flaps in. Alright, so there is our third notch of flaps. 60 knots. I'll go ahead and bring that power back in. And I'll take that carb heat off now that we're in the green band. Looking for about 2300 RPMs. May need to bring it down to 2200 to get it stabilized at that 55 knots. But once you are established in level flight, then 2300 should keep you at about 55 knots. And I'm trimming it out, still wants to nose down just a little bit here. So I'm putting some nose up trim in there. And there it's getting just a little bit slow. Holding level flight okay, but a little slow, so I'll add some power. And I'm drifting off my heading, so I'll just make a little turn to get back on the heading. A little slow, so I'll add a little more power. About 50 knots. You'll see it's a little difficult to recover speed. It takes quite a bit of power to recover just a little bit of speed when we're doing these maneuvers. And there's the airspeed coming back up now. Alright, there's 55 knots. I'll set it about 2300 RPM. Make sure it's good and trimmed. And we are established in flight at approach speeds. Alright, so let's try some turns just to get a feel for how the airplane handles at this airspeed. You may need to add a little bit of power as you go into the turn and apply just a little bit of back pressure to keep from slowing down or losing altitude. Alright, so I'm going to bank. I'm going to do about a 20-degree turn here, or a 20-degree bank. Again, you want to lead your roll out by about 10 degrees. Just a little bit of power so I don't get too slow. And notice the rate of turn. Even though I'm doing a 20-degree bank, there's my 10 degrees, it's doing well more than a standard rate of turn, which really, normally at 95 knots, 20 degrees to give us a nice standard rate turn, but it's doing quite a bit more than that. All right, so we'll do a bank around to the right, and then notice the way the controls feel. It's taking a little more control input to get it to maneuver, and everything happens just a little bit slower at this airspeed. Leave my roll out by about 10 degrees. So just take some time, do some turns, get a feel for how the airplane handles at this airspeed doing turns. Alright, so let's try some descents and see how the airplane feels doing a descent with this configuration and this airspeed. We're going to be going below the green arc, so I'm going to throw the carburetor heat on, and then I'll bring it back to about 2,000 RPMs. Just like a normal descent, I want to hold my hold my airspeed with my pitch, and then the power is going to control my descent rate. So you can see 2,000 RPMs. It's up and down a little bit, but it gives us about 300 feet per minute, and this is a good speed for flying our landing approach. We'll want to do about, to calculate your descent rate on an approach, take your ground speed and divide it in half, so 60 is 30, add a 0, and that gives you 300 feet per minute to maintain a 3-degree glide slope, which is what most of your visual glide slope indicators at airports are set at, and also what most of your electronic ILS glide slopes are set up. So that shows you about what you need in terms of power and pitch to get about a 300 foot per minute descent. So just play around with that power and that pitch. Try to maintain 55 knots and 300 feet per minute. And then you can also pull the power to idle and just take a look, maintain your pitch, and you can get an idea how fast the airplane will go down. You can see you get well more than 1,000 feet a minute, about 1,200 feet a minute, which I think is probably a little more than the 170 or the 152 will actually do. But it gives you an idea of how quickly the airplane can descend when it's configured like this. I'll go ahead and put my power back up to 2,000. Kind of do the last bit of the descent here at about a 300 feet per minute rate. And just like the normal level off, we want to lead our level off by about 10% rate of our rate of descent. So at about 50 feet, we'll add the power back in to 2,300 feet. We'll turn the carb heat back off. So there's about 30 feet. I'll go ahead and bring the power back in, let the nose come up, carb heat comes off, and then stabilize it at about 2,300 RPM. And we're back at level flight. A little slow, so I'll put a little power in. It's trying to climb a little bit, so I've got the pitch a little high. Let it get back to 55 knots there. So that's another thing to practice, is doing a couple of descents at this configuration. This gives you a good feel for how the airplane is going to handle on landing approach. 55 knots is our short field approach speed. Normal approach speed, at least on final, will be about 60 knots. So that's a little slower than we'd actually be doing in the pattern, but it will still give you a good feel for how the airplane handles. Another variation on the maneuver that you'll want to practice is descending turns, as this is going to be something you're going to be doing in the traffic pattern to set up for a landing approach. Just like the normal descending turn in cruise flight, you can do this at 20 degrees of bank, just like we did with the other slow flight maneuvers. Control your pitch, or excuse me, control your airspeed with your pitch and your descent rate with your power. And basically it's the same as the other maneuvers we practiced with this configuration, but it gives you a good feel for how the airplane will handle in the traffic pattern. And finally, for our flight at approach speeds, we'll attempt to climb, and I say attempt because you'll notice I'll put in full power here, which wasn't much less than what I already had in there, and maintain 55 knots. And does it climb? Yes, it does, but not by much. We're getting maybe 100 or 200 foot per minute on the climb, so just barely a positive rate of climb. And the point I want to drive home is this on this airplane, is that at a high drag configuration with full flaps, this airplane does not want to climb. Even at 60 knots at your approach speed, it would still be very reticent to climb. That's why our go-around procedure is going to be apply full power, carb heat off, and reduce the flaps to 20 degrees. Once you get to 20 degrees, the airplane will want to climb, but you can say it's taking us almost a full minute to get 100 feet up here. So this airplane does not want to climb in a high drag configuration. All right, so let's go ahead and recover to straight and level flight. I will go ahead and bring my power to full, and I'm going to retract my flaps to 20. I'm going to hold that pitch to hold the altitude and allow the airplane to accelerate. There's 60 knots, so I'll start bringing the flaps all the way up. As you bring the flaps up, it's going to momentarily pitch down, but that's just going to be a momentary thing, so control that with your stick pressure. Okay, flaps are up to 0, and now we're just like we're in a normal level off from a climb. We're just going to pitch, let the airplane accelerate, hold our altitude. There's 95 knots. Go ahead and pull the power back to 2,300 RPM, and then we trim for level flight. Before we get to proficiency standards, I will mention that this is not an FAA required maneuver. It's just a maneuver I'd like you to try just to get comfortable handling the airplane at approach speed, since this will be the same speeds roughly that we'll be flying when we're doing our landing approaches. And I've taken the standards from what used to be the practical test standards. I guess it's Airman Certification Standards now, but I've taken these standards from what they expect on landing approaches. So consider yourself proficient at flying at approach speeds when you can maintain that 55 knots plus 10 minus 5 knots. Maintain or level off at your assigned altitude plus or minus 100 feet. And maintain or roll out on a heading plus or minus 10 degrees. So slow flight is the actual FAA required maneuver on the private pilot check ride, and there's two different ways you can do it in landing configuration and clean configuration, and you'll see it's just a little bit different than what we do for the flight at approach speeds. The objective for slow flight is to fly at the slowest speed that will not produce a stall warning, so pretty darn slow. In the 152, that speed is 35 knots of indicated airspeed, but the FAA standards give you a tolerance of plus 10 and minus 0 knots when you're flying the maneuver. So what I recommend doing is actually targeting 40 knots, and that gives you a tolerance of plus or minus 5 knots either side of that speed. The maneuver entry is going to be pretty much identical to what we did for maneuvering at approach speeds. You're going to apply carburetor heat, reduce your power to 2,000 RPM, use pitch to hold altitude and allow the aircraft to slow. Again, trim as needed. You're going to need to trim nose up. At 85 knots, extend the flaps to 30 degrees in the 10-degree increments. Again, you'll want to do it with just a little pause in between each one. At about 5 knots prior, about 45 knots, you want to increase your power to 2,300 to 2,400 RPM again. Again, you'll want the carb heat off, and it's going to be pretty close to full throttle again. And then use your power and your pitch to control altitude and speed. Just like the approach speed, we'll do some maneuvers during that slow flight. We'll practice turns of up to 20 degrees of bank, and again, you'll see that rate of turn is going to be increased. Again, practicing descents. This is something the FAA might require on a private pilot check ride. And again, control the airspeed with the pitch and descent rate with the power. And then once again, attempting to climb, you'll see even though we're going at a slower speed, it's still not going to want to climb. Exiting the maneuver is going to be pretty much identical to exiting the approach speed maneuver. Smoothly apply full power. Turn off your carburetor heat if it's not already off. Reduce your flaps to 20 initially. At 60 knots, retract the flaps to 0 in the 10-degree increments. And then hold the altitude with pitch. Again, you're going to need to trim down as the aircraft accelerates. And then at 95 knots, reduce the power to 2,300 RPM and trim back for a normal cruise, straight and level flight. All right, so we are back stabilized, straight and level flight at 3,500 feet on a heading of 180. So we'll go ahead and set up for slow flight. We've already done our pre-maneuver chores, and it's basically the same maneuver, just targeting a lower airspeed. So we'll go ahead and throw that carb heat on. RPMs drop a little bit. We'll bring our power back to 2,000 RPMs. And we will pitch to maintain our altitude, allow the aircraft to slow, looking for 85 knots to put the first notch of flaps out there. There's 85, so here comes our first notch. Airplane's going to want to balloon a little bit as we bring flaps out, so we'll control that with pitch. Go and bring the second notch of flaps out. You notice it starts decelerating quite a bit more quickly when we get that next notch of flaps out. And then bring our last notch of flaps out. Then we're looking to lead the power increase by about 5 knots. So when we get to 45 knots, that's where we'll increase our power. Still pitching for the altitude. There's 45 knots. I'm going to bring my power in. Gradually. Starting to lose altitude, so I need to pitch up a little more. I'm back in the green band, so I'll bring the carburetor heat back out. And about 2,300 to 2,400 RPM should do it. Maybe not quite full throttle on this one. And then of course we trim to just like we would in normal cruise flight, so that we don't have to continually apply the back pressure to keep the aircraft at the desired pitch. You can see with all that drag out there and with that slow airspeed, to maintain altitude at this speed, we are having to pitch up. Looks like about 5 degrees pitch up to maintain our altitude. Still need a little more trim in there. Oops, too much pitch there. A little more power, getting a little slow. My 5-knot tolerance there. Have to bring back full power in there to get sped back up. The other thing you'll notice is in this airspeed regimen, it doesn't accelerate very quickly either. Alright, so now we've got it stabilized at 40 knots, 3,500 feet, heading of 180. We're established in slow flight. Alright, so we're established in straight and level at slow flight here. So let's try a couple of turns just to get a feel for how the aircraft handles at this speed with turns. You'll notice it's very sluggish to react to the ailerons now. You've got very little airflow going over those ailerons. The other thing you'll notice is I'm only doing about 15 degrees of bank, and we've got a pretty good rate of turn going there. Forget to lead your level off, and you'll need a pretty good amount of control input to get the airplane to roll back out. So we'll try the turn back around to the right. And again, you're just getting a feel for how the aircraft reacts and how the aircraft controls at this speed. Alright, so that's some maneuvering flight. So practice a couple of those turns just to get a feel for how the aircraft handles differently at the edge of its low speed envelope. We'll also want to practice descents and descending turns, so we'll pull the power back to about 2,000 RPM. And the rate of descent on this one is not as important. Again, we're just trying to get a feel for how the aircraft handles at the lower end of its envelope. And again, you probably need to drop the power just a little bit more than you're used to get it to descend at a rate that you'd like. And again, and once you're in the descent, try some descending turns just to get a feel for how the airplane handles in a descending turn at this airspeed. Another thing you'll notice is even with the power at idle at this airspeed, it doesn't descend quite as quickly as it did when we were at our approach speed. And we'll go ahead and level off at 2,500 feet just like we did with the last maneuver. And again, we want to lead the level off by about half of our rate of descent. Or excuse me, 10% of our rate of descent. Half your angle of bank to lead out the turns. So going down at about 300 feet per minute right now, so we'll lead it by 30 feet. And just bring our power back in very gradually. Back level at 2,500 feet now. So practice some descents as well. Don't forget to turn your carburetor heat on if you're electing to use carburetor heat like I forgot to do. And just practice those descents and descending turns as well. And lastly, we'll attempt to climb. And I think you'll see it's pretty much the same as we had at approach speed. We put in full power, which we were almost there already, and maintain 40 knots. It'll eke out a small climb, but not a very good one, which just again hammers home the fact that this airplane does not like to climb at low airspeeds with high drag. You're going to have to get rid of some of that drag to get the airplane to climb. I'm going to go ahead and level back at 2,500 feet and we'll do the recovery. So we have our power full in. We'll keep our altitude and go to flaps 20. Let the airplane accelerate. Try to keep our heading on 180 there. Airplane's accelerating past 60. We'll go ahead and start pulling the flaps up all the way. Make sure to get them all the way up before we get to 85 knots. And then it just becomes a normal level off type maneuver. We're trimming to maintain our pitch to maintain our altitude. Not trimming down quite enough. We get to 95 knots, we'll pull the power back to 2300 RPM and recover to normal, straight and level flight. Another way that the FAA can choose to see slow flight is in the clean configuration, which is a little bit different. So you're flying at that slow speed without the flaps down, with your flaps up. Again, the objective is to fly at the slowest speed that's not going to produce a stall warning. In the 152 for flaps up, we're going to target 45 knots. The stall warning actually comes on sometime around 42 knots, at least it has been for me. So we're giving ourselves a little bit of a buffer from that speed. Maneuver entry is going to be slightly different than it's been for the other two maneuvers. Initially, we're going to apply the carburetor heat and then reduce power to 1500 RPM instead of 2000. That's because at 2000 RPMs, without putting drag out, it's going to take a long time to slow down, and it probably won't actually get to that 45 knots, or at least it'll take all day to get there. Just like we did for the other maneuvers, use the pitch to hold altitude and allow the aircraft to slow. Trim as needed. You won't need as much nose-up trim, but you'll probably need a little bit. Again, about 5 knots prior to the target airspeed. Increase your power to approximately 2,000 RPM this time. And because we're below the green arc, you're going to want to leave the carb heat on for this maneuver. It's not going to be as difficult to hold altitude since you don't have all that drag out there. Again, just like the other maneuvers, use power and pitch to control the altitude and speed. We'll go ahead and do some maneuvering in this configuration just to get a feel for how it flies when it's got the flaps up and it's flying slow. Again, turns up to 20 degrees of bank. We'll do descents and attempt climbs, and actually you should be able to climb without the flaps out. It should climb pretty well at this airspeed. Exiting maneuver is a little less complicated actually than getting out of the other two since we don't have flaps to deal with. Go ahead and smoothly apply full power, turn the carburetor heat off, hold the altitude with pitch, and you'll need to trim down as the aircraft accelerates. It's going to accelerate a little bit quicker without all that drag out there. And then again at 95 knots, reduce the power to 2300 RPM and trim for a level flight. This maneuver is good practice for when we do a no-flap traffic pattern, which we'll do as part of our abnormal procedures training towards the end of the training, because the 152 can actually fly pattern and land without any flaps, and this will give us some practice at controlling it at lower airspeeds without the flaps. All right, so I'm stabilized again at 3,500 feet, straight and level flight, 180 heading. We have our pre-maneuver chores done, so now we're going to try slow flight in the clean configuration. The entry on this one will be a little bit different because we don't have the flaps to help us slow down with the drag, so we'll use a little bit lower power setting. So I'll go ahead and throw the carb heat on. I'll pull the power back to about 1,500 RPMs. Again, a little lower power setting, since we don't have the drag with the flaps to help us out there. I'll pitch to maintain my altitude. And allow the airplane to slow down. It's actually a little less complicated because we don't have to bring the flaps out on this one. Just focusing basically on pitch and power. Target airspeed is going to be 45 knots for this maneuver. Again, I'm trimming so I don't have to keep putting that back pressure in there. And we'll lead the power entry by about 5 knots, so about 50 knots. We'll put the power back in. We'll be targeting about 2,000 RPM. Again, without that drag out there, we don't need quite as much power. So there is 50 knots, so I'll slowly bring my power back in there. And we're coming up on 45 knots. And we'll leave the carb heat in on this maneuver since we are staying below the green arc. We'll just leave that carb heat in there. All right, so there we are, stabilized, 3,500 feet, about 45 knots. And welcome to slow flight in the clean configuration. All right, so we'll try a couple of turns in the clean configuration just to get a feel for what the airplane handles like. do about a 10-degree bank turn on this one because it seems to be riding a little closer to the edge of a stall on this one. If you go much beyond that, you're going to start getting a stall warning horn. If you do get a stall warning horn like that, drop your nose just a little bit, add a little power, or reduce the bank just a little bit, and that will stop that stall warning horn. And we'll do a turn back around to the right, and again, kind of note the angle of bank, or excuse me, the rate of turn here. You notice even though we're doing a very gentle turn, we're still getting a pretty good rate of turn. So practice a couple of those turns and just get a feel for how the airplane handles without the drag out there at slow flight in this clean configuration. We'll also want to practice descents and descending turns, and you want to bring your power back to about 1500 RPM for the descent, but it's just like any other descent that you control your speed with your pitch and your descent rate with your power. It just takes a lot less power to get the airplane to go down at this speed and this configuration. One other thing you'll notice about flight at this airspeed and in this configuration is that even if you bring your power all the way to idle without that drag, you're just not going to get a huge descent rate even at this low airspeed. And just like our other descents, we'll lead the level off, lead the power entry by about 10% of the rate of descent. We're doing about 400 feet per minute down right now, so about 40 feet, we start to add that power in, and again about 2,000 RPMs should be what gives us level flight at 45 knots in the clean configuration. Alright, recovery is a little more straightforward in this one. We go ahead and bring our power smoothly to full power, bring that carb heat in, pitch down as the airplane accelerates, and don't forget to put your trim in. And we don't have to deal with flaps in this one, so it just becomes a normal level off maneuver. Wait for the airplane to accelerate to 95 knots and then reduce our power while we're trimming the whole time to keep that pitch that we want to maintain level flight. There's 95 knots, so I'll bring the power back to 2300 RPM. And make sure we're good and trimmed out for straight and level flight. You'll notice it's a little squirrely on the headings in these slow flight maneuvers. So you have to pay attention to that and make sure and make little small corrections to keep it on the heading, to keep within standards there. The proficiency standards for slow flight are the same in landing and the clean configuration. Again, we've modified this a little bit from the FAA standards because we've upped our airspeed just a little bit. So we're going to maintain the target airspeed plus or minus 5 knots. Maintain or level off at your assigned altitude plus or minus 100 feet. And maintain or roll out on your assigned heading plus or minus 10 degrees. That's it for this lesson. The next lesson we'll find out what happens when we go beyond the bottom of the airspeed indicator. We'll talk about learning to recognize a stall and recover from a stall. See you next time.